Thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. This is going to, it's a graveyard shift and we're talking about regulation. I get that, it might be a struggle to stay awake. Riffing off Axiology's talk just previously, you saw the difficulty that they're having in becoming regulated in order to use decentralised technologies. And this is the common theme, that what regulators really want is a throat to choke. And where they can't find a throat to choke, they go about making one exist. And so everything that Axiology has to do is kind of like being that entity that regulators can go to if there is a problem. And so what I want to talk today about is the 5 areas that I think regulators, despite all of the talk about how they're going to embrace digital asset technology, how they see that there's benefit, there's still gridlock, there's still not a lot happens. And I think these are 5 areas where I would love to see regulators really tackle with the problems in depth rather than skim the surface. And the background of this is that in 2001, the Australian Senate asked for submissions on how to better regulate DAOs in Australia. And it wanted to do it without creating a new corporate form. So we have detailed company legislation and we don't have what exists in Wyoming and Cayman Islands and places like that, these very light companies. And they didn't want to create a new company and they wanted proposals on how to do it. And I spent, it was probably the most difficult sort of intellectual challenge in this space that I've engaged in, to come up with this really limited, a custodian, community smart contracts holds all digital assets subject to its code. These 2 sentences were the outcome of, some 28 pages of proposed legislation and 22 different definitions. And that's what you had to go to if you weren't going to create a new entity. If you weren't going to create a new throat to choke, you needed to identify what a blockchain was, you needed to identify what the users were, and you needed to give these people interacting in these ecosystems some kind of freedom to engage in activity without liability. And what I discovered is that all of this is one giant Rubik's Cube where everything's connected to everything else, and it was tremendously difficult to regulate, to come up with a meaningful set of provisions that didn't allow for regulatory arbitrage, for people to get away with stuff they shouldn't be allowed to get away with, and didn't end up destroying the very technology that we were trying to regulate. And it's complicated because the whole purpose of blockchains, they're a social scaling institution. There's this, we need strangers to be able to coordinate with each other without trust. And our traditional institutions for doing that are groaning. The internet has exploded our capacity to do deals, to meet people, but it didn't make the trust layer flow at the same degree. So our institutions are groaning under the strain of providing that trust layer. And that's what we want out of blockchain, but they're objective technologies, right? They make things happen in the real world, whereas our legal norms are intersubjective realities. They're just things that we agree are true. And we can unagree that they're true, or we can agree just not to enforce them in this particular sequence. It's incredibly flexible, and meshing those 2 together is incredibly difficult. And the areas that I really would, the 5 areas are dealing with what is a blockchain legally, the propertiness of digital assets, when is a smart contract exploit actually wrong, facilitating interconnectivity, and for God's sake, think about the devs. So let's talk about what is a blockchain, like legally. Most of the, if blockchain was being run as a traditional type of project, it would look something like this. In the centre would be miners and there'd be a JV agreement or a partnership agreement or some sort of document governing how this network is to function. They would have agreements with core network developers, the coders, and there would be some sort of software development agreement and a whole bunch of rules around how that all works. Users, there'd be some kind of end-user license agreement, and if I had smart contracts, I would need some sort of service level agreement or some sort of software license agreement to use the network, and I'd have an end-user license agreement with my users. Now, this is the world that regulators are used to having exist, and this is the world they would like to recreate when they look at this technology. And you can see it clearly with the EU's proposed guidelines on how to deal with privacy in the blockchain space. Basically, they're saying, if you are into blockchain, don't do it. And if you do it, make it private and permissioned. And once you've made it private and permissioned, make it work like this, because we understand this. And the issue with this is, at each stage, there's a relationship and there's a capacity to grant rights, impose obligations, and most importantly, to manage risk and liability. All of those agreements will have terms in them that regulate that arrangement. Blockchain's got none of that. Right? It's just people doing stuff. And you can define what it is technically, and a lot of the regulations do this. You know, they would define what they mean by a blockchain when they're trying to regulate it. But they don't go the extra step and give us the benefit of defining the legal relationships that are involved in this process. So, is the blockchain just a thing? Is it a legal entity? Is it a relationship like partnership or joint venture? And is it none of these things? And if so, what? You'll constantly see regulators talk about the blockchain as though it's a thing as though it's a person, right? As though it's like a company, right? And my students do the same thing. They'll talk about the protocol must, or the protocol should have rights. And the protocol's just software, right? So if you're going to give people rights, or you're going to impose obligations on them, what you want is a legal entity. And what you don't want is your blockchain being a legal entity, because then it becomes just a centralised thing. That's nothing new, right? If your blockchain is just a company, that's something we already know. We don't need a new thing to do that thing. And so the key question, when I download open source code and I sync my machine to this global network, what have I done? No one's answering this question. When you create a public-private key pair on an open permissionless blockchain, what have you done? What rights and obligations have you just assumed? Right? Have you joined a partnership? Have you got shares in a company? Have you got shares in an investment scheme? Have you joined a cult? Like, you just don't know. You do it, but none of those rights have been properly defined, and it would be really helpful if it were. In order to do this, regulators really needed, firstly you need to identify by blockchain and digital ledger technology, there's such a wide range of options, but only some of those are technologies that you want to advance. Only some of those are things that you think are a future social scaling institution. The other things are probably not, right? So public, open, permissionless blockchains are new and different. But if you've got a private, permissioned blockchain, maybe that's not really a blockchain, right? If it's just 5 entities running 5 machines, and it involves cryptography, but it's just those 5 people, that's probably just a joint venture or a partnership. That's probably something we already know. It's not something brand new and wonderful. You need to identify users. This is a particular problem I came across. A user in my mind was someone that created a public-private key pair. That's it, right? Because that could be a person, it could be a company, but equally, the entities that control public-private key pairs on blockchain networks could be AI, could be smart contracts, and could be smart contracts that operate under code that's completely autonomous. But they're still a user of the network, and it was still useful to define them as a concept. You need to define miner and validator, and that's not easy because there's all these other things like submission nodes or witness nodes, etc., that are part of the network. And you've got to give those people those rights and obligations. What can users expect of miners or validators? And vice versa, what can miners and validators expect of users? What obligations do you have about how you use a network? And that becomes important when we look at things like smart contract exploits. The problem, if you don't fill in the gaps, is that tort and equity, these large areas of law that just simply apply, will fill in the gaps. And they'll fill in the gaps in potentially perverse ways. So up here on the screen, this is the example of the litigation that emerged from the Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin Satoshi Vision hard fork. And a whole bunch of tort and a whole bunch of equitable claims were made about how that fork was fought, right? Alleging that these miners had certain obligations to other miners or certain obligations to users, etc., over the code fork. And you don't want that. You would love for your regulation to make some of this clear. And in my mind, it should be to remove the law, reasonably completely, so that you are free to engage in these technologies. This is the key problem, though, is the propertiness of the digital assets. In this space, we're used to thinking of these things as property, and we talk about it as though they are, but it's actually not settled. We know at common law that information isn't property, but digital assets are nothing but information. But we seem to accept that they are property, but even that is under question. And there's this particular case in Australia. What happened was a police officer, ex-now police officer, when inspecting the assets of a criminal, took the USB that his digital asset secret key was on, his Bitcoin address. And what this guy is alleging is that he didn't steal millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, he just stole the USB stick. And at the moment, the question is it in fact property at all that was stolen, or is it just information? So this is a particular problem still for blockchain technologies, and the issue is, well, if it is property, when is it, and is it always property? The previous case flies in the face of all of the existing jurisprudence. By and large, courts are accepting that digital assets are some form of property. But when they do accept that it's some form of property, it's because you need to meet certain definitions. It needs to be definable, identifiable by third parties, transferable and of value, and have some degree of permanence or stability. Now, we can believe that that's true of most digital assets. Most of the cases involve Bitcoin, and the problem is Bitcoin is like the all-singing, all-dancing version of a hard digital asset. But it's not clear which of these elements are necessary as part of the underlying technology for the digital asset to actually be an asset, for it to be property and not information, right? If I've got an entry on an Excel spreadsheet that says that somebody owes me $100 and I delete that entry, the debt, the $100 doesn't get deleted, just the entry. I can create and destroy that information. It's not true of stuff on a distributed ledger. But the issue is how distributed and what type of technology does it involve. How many nodes? How decentralised does it have to be for the information to become property? How public and permissionless, right? This is very crucial as we move to regulated assets. If you're going to have, as we saw with Axiology, largely private, permissioned type blockchains to meet financial regulation, well, if it's too private and too centralised, then you don't have a digital asset. All you've got is an entry on a ledger that someone controls and can delete and can change and reverse and put back. And that's nothing new, right? We're used to, what you have as air miles or frequent flyer points aren't property. You might have rights that you can assert against the company in their terms of service. But those air miles are things that they can delete and things that they can, inflate away, and there's no property rights in those. Public-private key pair, is that an essential part? Is that necessary for it to be property to meet all of these tests, and what sort of governance? So the issue is, what turns a digital asset back into information and vice versa? At what point does the underlying technology allow for this particular characterisation? And even if it is property, how do you know that you own it? This is something that's still not addressed, which is the negotiability of digital assets. This whole not your keys, not your crypto isn't true, right? When you if you're going to say these things are property and you can own it, you can certainly own something that you don't possess. And so now that I've got that distinction, I have to work out, well, when is it your property? And one of the key problems is negotiability. So when you buy property, you can't get good title to something that has been stolen. The person from whom it's been stolen can get that property back. You have a claim against the person who fraudulently sold you stolen property, but you can't keep it. Well, what about crypto? All right, lots of crypto stolen all the time and laundered through exchanges. And there is an assumption that these are bearer instruments, i.e. if you front up with USDT, maybe you can redeem it. But that hasn't been tested and it's not certain. And it would be ideal if regulators did confirm whether and to what extent digital assets are negotiable. And even if you do own it, there's still the problem of what do you actually own. And this is a fundamental issue with digital assets. Is it my property on your chain? I have rights to the thing that you must persist. Or is my asset simply the things that I can do with my public-private key pair on your chain? Now, they're very different concepts, right? So if it's my asset on your chain, I'm far more likely to regard you as a custodian of my assets. I'm far more likely to regard you as a fiduciary who's responsible for maintaining the value in the thing that I own. But if it's like Bitcoin, where Bitcoin doesn't exist outside its network, it's a native asset. So all you've got is the public-private key pair, and you can do whatever that public-private key pair lets you do. If you go down that route, you end up conceiving that, well, the property right's actually in the private key. It's not in the asset on the ledger. All of those assets that you can deal with your public-private key pair are simply manifestations of things you can do on that ledger. This will affect things like hard forks, chains, miners as fiduciaries, custodial infrastructure, smart contract exploits. All of this comes down to, is it your asset that's being degraded by things that others are doing on the chain? Or are you simply getting what the chain has agreed to give you, which is simply whatever you can do with your public-private key pair? The other problem is it'll vary between native assets, ERC20 tokens, real-world assets, right? So a native asset has no counterparty. It literally is just what it is. And so it's easier to conceive that is, you get what you get from the chain. But a real-world asset, tokenised on-chain, it can't possibly be the asset. That gold bar that has been turned into a token, if that token vanishes, if you lose your public-private key pair, if you send it to a black hole address, the gold bar still exists. And so there's someone that has an obligation to maintain that link, that bit of string between the digital thing and the real-world thing. And if the digital thing ceases to exist, they've got to go back and recreate that bit of string. Now that asset, that tokenised asset's probably not a piece of property, right? It's probably just a ledger entry that represents a debt or a series of rights that you can enforce against the person who promises that there's a bit of gold that backs up this digital asset. They're very different concepts in property, one of which we know all about and the other which is brand new. So then we have the problem of, what about smart contracts? Smart contracts exploits. Firstly, they're not smart, they're not contracts, right? So they're bits of code. I like to think of them code that you impose on your digital assets by signing a valid network transaction. Right, literally, here's my asset, I'm going to send it to this address, and having sent it to that address, it's going to become subject to the code that's at that address. If they're not contracts, how are they breached or exploited? What does it mean to cheat a smart contract? And there's this recent case involving Mr. Eisenberg. His conviction for fraud was quashed on the basis that he hadn't engaged in anything fraudulent. He exploited the contract for profit, but nothing made what he did cheater. He didn't mislead anybody. He just did it. And the code isn't like a human. You're not cheating it. But on the other side of the coin, there's this case, Medjovic, which is from the indexed hack, where he's currently being pursued by the Department of Justice in the US for, it was an exploit involving flash loans. He basically tricked the contract into believing that the price was higher and lower than the price that it actually was. He's being sued and Eisenberg just got off. Now why? Now I think that there's actually 3 different types of contract depending on who can change them. You've got smart contracts that are indistinguishable from their network. They change in the same way that the network code changes. There are contracts that are community contracts in the sense that there's some limited subset of users who can agree to change the contract code. And then there are contracts that are developer contracts. They are literally just agents of the developer because the developer or the developer team can change the code. Most of the law cases, unfortunately, involve developer contracts. When you look at it, like this index case, this contract was in beta, and so the developer still had the capacity to change the code. That's not really handy in working out when is a contract exploit illegal versus when is it's not, because really what you're dealing with isn't a decentralised smart contract. You're dealing with a centralised service being provided over a decentralised network, but the contract really is the developer. And one of the things that will differentiate poor old Medjedovic versus Eisenberg is that there's a website. Because it looks like every other piece of financial product, there's a website that describes what it does. And because it describes what it does, I can say that this guy has cheated it. This is its intended operation, and what he's done is breached its intended operation, and so potentially I've got misleading and deceptive conduct or some sort of fraud. But it's still fraud not on a smart contract, it's fraud on the developers who have specified how they think their contract's going to work. Whereas Eisenberg's situation, there were no 2NCs. There was no website that described what it could or should do, and so there's nothing that you've cheated. Now that would be weird if remedies depended upon how centralised the smart contract was. We need more guidance from regulators about when smart contracts are breached and what constitutes an exploit versus what just constitutes a badly written contract for which maybe the developers are liable, but not for which the user is liable for how they profited from that breach. The challenge, I think, is not to force everything to be a developer contract. Again, regulators, they want to throat to choke. If I require you as the developer to maintain some sort of control of the smart contract so that you can remedy breaches, then I'm reintroducing centralisation. This is not a decentralised service, this becomes a centralised service, and eventually everything would devolve into being a centralised service offered by regulated entities, and nothing's decentralised. Now, if that's what you want as a regulator, then say it, and don't pretend that it's anything else. The fourth thing that regulators are not properly addressing is interconnectivity. We know that one chain isn't going to rule, everybody, and that means we're going to have interoperability between chains. Interoperability means that someone outside the chain has to tell the chain what's true about the outside world. Whether it's an oracle, a bridge, or an exchange that's providing that mechanism for cross-chain functionality, we don't have a comprehensive regime yet or any proposals about how to regulate oracles. And I think that's one of the main lacks. So exchanges, yes, and bridges, we can kind of get a head around that, but we're not thinking about oracles. And the problem with oracles is they matter for real-world tokenisation. Our project that I presented 2 years ago, Digital Cows, it works because there was a regime dealing with intermediaries. There was an existing thing called a stock and station agent with obligations, and we could use that as an oracle. And I think what would really improve the space is some sort of structured thinking around oracles. When are you an oracle? What's your conduct? How are you liable? Finally, we need to think of the devs. There's a constant movement to make devs fiduciaries. The reason for this is that they're now dealing in chains that secure people's assets. The problem that you get to is that, well, it's free open source software, there's a free open source license, does it mean anything? If it doesn't mean anything, well, why do we allow it to happen? And the problem that we get if we don't leave the devs alone is the first step that you'll do is you will incorporate. The second thing you'll do is go get insurance. The third thing you do is try and reduce the cost of your insurance by showing that you can mitigate the risk of loss and damage. That means you've got to retain control. If you retain control, then you end up eventually with a blockchain that's just a service offered by a dev team, and everything becomes centralised again. So we really do need some sort of open source, or some sort of solution for the devs. There's something special that happens when you sufficiently decentralise public permissionless blockchain. And it works despite no one knowing or trusting each other. But because of this, its ledger's entries become something valuable. They become assets. But they're not trustless. That property can be made subject to binding code that may be unreliable. Many groovier functions rely on trusted people like oracles to tell the chain what's true about the outside world. They rely upon the quality of the code produced by devs who often do it for free under free open source license. And threading this needle isn't easy because too much regulation, too much manufacturing that throat to choke will slowly throttle the industry. You will end up with the centralised network. And the problem if your ledger is centralised is potentially your assets are no longer property. Potentially I've made your assets just worthless database entries. Thank you.